You're listening to This Motorcycle Life, conversations about why we ride. Episode 28, Ghost in the Machine. I'm Bruce Philp, and thank you for listening. So, what does your motorcycle mean to you? For some riders, a motorcycle is a tool, a means to an end. But sometimes in a rider's life, a bike turns out to be more than that. An object not just of functional value, but almost of existential value. In a moment, you're going to hear the story of a bike that started out as someone's reason to live, and then went on to become even more than that. We'll talk to one of the builders of that motorcycle in a minute, but first, let's take care of some important business. By now, you can probably recite this part from memory. Thank you, as always, for the emails and reviews that you've given me since the last episode. Those ratings and reviews help people find this podcast, and the emails really make me feel like part of this family, which is, more than anything, what keeps me going. A couple of special mentions. Chris is a new rider from my hometown of London, Ontario, and after my nerdy reference to Joseph Campbell in the last episode, he one-upped me with a brilliant email paralleling motorcycling and stoicism. That was awesome. And the other is David from near Louisville, Kentucky, who suggested this episode's guest and then introduced us. I don't always have a lot of luck tracking down the guests that listeners suggest, but David went the extra mile to make this happen, and I think you're going to appreciate that as much as I did. And I want to remind you that if you enjoy this podcast, I'd love you to let me know by donating whatever you can to the Movember Foundation. I know this is a tough moment to be thinking about charity, but Movember has been providing some important mental health support during this challenging time. To donate, click on the mustache in my show notes or my weekly newsletter. I should mention that this link was broken last month, for which I apologize, but it's fixed now. And be sure to follow Movember on Instagram to learn more about what they're doing to help right now. Okay, here we go. Well, the opportunity to speak with this episode's guest came at an interesting moment for me, although my story is not nearly as profound as you're about to hear. Because even as I was going through the process of preparing and conducting this interview, I was dealing with my own sentimental attachment to a motorcycle, and the question of what that sentiment was really worth to me. In a nutshell, here's the story. Last winter, I had a chance to ride a BMW R9T, and I really liked it. I liked it enough that it's kind of haunted me ever since. And with a lot of time on my hands, I have found myself eventually staring at them online and doing the math. And I'd almost convinced myself that I could manage one. After all, life is short. Of course, the question then became, which bike has to go in order to make room for a new one? Well, that seemed easy, because as it happens, the most logical candidate, my Triumph Scrambler, has had a run of mechanical bad luck. And it being more or less in the same style of bike as the one I wanted, it seemed like a slam dunk. Until I picked it up at the shop last week. And on that long, cold ride home, it reminded me of why I still have it. Not just because it's an exceptional motorcycle, because it isn't, but because of the flood of memories that get triggered every time I start it up. Because of how, over all the years I've owned it, it's grown me as a rider. How it made friends for me every time we stopped for gas or coffee. How, for some reason, these are the keys I reached for every time something important happened in my life. And how, frankly, the lens that it put on the world inspired these podcasts. And suddenly, the value equation turned upside down, and common sense revealed itself to be a pretty terrible mediator when it comes to motorcycles. I probably wouldn't miss the nuts and bolts of that machine for long, but I'd sure miss that continuity in my life, so the Triumph stays. And I'm left to wonder if I'm crazy. Well, for Matthew Biberman, the stakes were much, much higher. Matthew is the son of Big Sid Biberman, a former racer and later a legendary Vincent builder. Sid's work with those mythic British machines would earn him the admiration of fans like Peter Egan and Jay Leno. Though Matthew practically grew up on the pillion seats of his dad's Vincents, over the years, the two had become distant in the way that fathers and sons of a certain generation sometimes do. Until, one day, Big Sid had a near-fatal heart attack. And although he survived, his will to go on seemingly had not. So, in desperation, Matthew made him a bedside offer. Live, and together we'll build a Vincati. Well, what followed was an incredible story of second chances, chronicled in a wonderful book called Big Sid's Vincati. If anyone knows what a motorcycle can mean, it's gotta be Matthew Biberman. Now, I should warn you that while Matthew still works on Vincent's, his day job is as an English professor, so my inner nerd got a bit of a workout during this conversation. I promise you, Matthew's story is very much worth it. I reached Matthew Biberman at his home in Louisville, Kentucky. Hey, Matthew, thanks so much for speaking with me. How are you doing?
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you. I have to say, I devoured your book, Big Sid's Vincati, both as a fellow enthusiast, but also as a father and a son. I thought it was just terrific. And without prejudice to the conversation we're about to have, and I don't mean to embarrass you with praise, but I'm not sure many motorcycle writers have done a better job of presenting the motorcycle as a metaphor. So, we'll get to that. You don't have to respond now. But I did really love the book, and I'm looking forward to introducing it to the people who listen to this podcast. Before we dive into your story, I think it's important to just lay a little bit of groundwork for those of us who don't know much about Vincent's or about Big Sid. So I just want to ask you, I want to start with a couple of background questions. And then, as I say, we'll dive in. And the first one is, in a nutshell, what are or what were Vincent motorcycles, and why do they have such a mythic resonance for us?
Well, Vincent motorcycles were a British motorcycle, and they were designed and built by Philip Vincent, initially under the mark of HRD, Harold R. Davies, who had a motorcycle concern under his initials and won the Isle of Man. And growing up in England, Vincent idolized HRD in the way in which somebody might idolize Valentino Rossi today. So when he began his dream of being a motorcycle builder, he bought out the HRD company, which had gone under, and initially made his motorcycles a small run before World War II, using up through 1934 motorcycle engines that he bought, principally JAP engines, and then sort of in the Bruff Superior mode, assembling sort of in a custom motorcycle way, a small run of motorcycles. Then he brought in an Australian engineer named Phil Irving. Really, those two comprised the Vincent Brain Trust, and they designed first the 500cc and then 1000cc, first a single and then first a 500cc single and then 1000cc twin. And they introduced both before the onset of hostilities of World War II. But really, people didn't get a chance to know about Vincent's or believe really the performance characteristics that they were touting until civilian production resumed in 1947. And then they brought out about 11,000 of these singles and twins between the years of about 1946 and 1956. And what made those motorcycles legendary is the combination of top end speed that had never been achieved before by any motorcycle or car, really any vehicle that didn't leave that remained on the ground, and a list of design features that were really innovative for its day. So the combination of those two aspects of the history, the tremendous speed as well as the engineering innovation, is what made the Vincent legend.
Yeah, and I guess rolling free didn't hurt either. Somebody recently wrote that was the most famous motorcycle picture in the world, and it's certainly how I first heard that name. But it's interesting to me that the performance credentials of that brand were actually well earned, because legends in this business can be, they could take on a life of their own.
Right.
Right.
Right. I could a little bit more about that in that the Vincent legend, it follows in the legend model that we have come to expect from thinking about legends such as Vincent van Gogh. That is, the Vincents go through an initial phase when they're being made and produced, where they're extremely expensive and they're not really made in high numbers, so people don't really get a lot of exposure to them. And then when they go out of business, they're really not fashionable machines, because they're like Ford Model Ts. You can have them in any color you want as long as that color is black. And they weren't desirable in the way in which the beautiful blue and red sort of Triumph vertical twins captured the imagination of the next generation. So in the 60s and really through the 70s, it was quipped that you couldn't give a Vincent away. And I can certainly say, having grown up the son of a Vincent enthusiast, that's true. So that they crater in value and in reputation, and then all of a sudden, really in the 80s, they come back and sort of ascend Mount Olympus to become perhaps the most legendary motorcycle of all.
That's interesting and not surprising, I guess, once you say it. So let me get to my second background question then, since you've hinted at it. Introduce for us, if you could, Big Sid.
Sure. Well, Big Sid was my dad, and he passed in 2013. He was born in 1930. And he grew up the son of a butcher in Norfolk, Virginia, and was also a proud Jew and would want me to mention that. So a little unusual. And he was called Big Sid because he was big. He was 6'5" and around 300 pounds, and really as a young man in very good shape, very much a kind of giant, who was utilized by his father as really neat muscle to haul sides of beef around. The principal business of the butcher shop was really delivering meat to restaurants, and my father did that as a young man, and found that as a big sort of lumbering giant, that when he had the opportunity to ride a Whizzer scooter and then move up to his first motorcycles, his new one being a matchless Super Clubman twin, and then the Vincent, that being liberated, it felt like he was liberated from his body when he had the opportunity to ride and go through S curves and lean over. And he was immediately smitten with the experience. So he was a lifelong motorcycle rider. And the other thing about Big Sid was that he really was an intuitive wrench. He was simply naturally gifted with an ability to understand how to build, service, and maintain motorcycles, and fell in love with Vincent's because they were, at the time, this engineering marvel, and so outstripped anything else that naturally gravitated towards it. And in that, he wasn't alone. Vincent's tended to attract individuals that were fascinated by the characteristics we've already laid out, the cleverness and originality of the design, and the tremendous performance that the machine offered. So later, he first drag raced Vincent's with success in the 50s and early 60s, and then ultimately opened up his own motorcycle shop in Virginia Beach, Virginia in the early 70s, and really serviced anything that anybody brought to him. And then as Vincent's rose in value, he began to concentrate more on Vincent work, not just because he loved it, but really simply because it was the best return on his investment in terms of what he could work on, and ultimately came to specialize largely in Vincent restoration and performance work until his death in 2013.
I mean, as you describe him in the book, it seems like his mechanical abilities were almost supernatural, the sort of thing you don't sort of see much anymore. Is that a fair statement? Because what you've described just now is a very talented mechanic, but it seems to me like he was a bit more than that.
That's true. You know, it is somewhat liberating. It's sad, but it's been 7 years now since Sid died. To be able to talk about Sid now that he's passed, because I don't really feel like I have to, defend anything or fear that I'm misrepresenting the truth. He did, for example, really play that game with his mechanics when somebody rolled a bike into the shop because it simply was dead, that he would he would often take it back out into the parking lot and walk it around and then lay hands on it as if he was some kind of Bible, evangelical snake handler and declare what he thought the problem would be. And then his mechanic would tear into it. And more often than not, he was right. And the other thing that I would say about that is that, I was really, each of us who grew up in motorcycling has a different story about it. But for me, it's really true that I never went for a ride with my father ever, that we didn't come back. We never were stranded, ever. Never. And when he says that when he went racing, and then later after Big Sid Vincati, we resumed racing, we never broke. Or if we broke, it broke conveniently. But at the end of the day, we got our runs in and we set our records. Mm. And the thing about him in that is that it reminds me a lot of years ago, I saw a video that followed one GP season. And it's Valentino Rossi and Max Biaggi, and you meet the doctor who certifies the GP riders that they're okay to go. And he said that he put heart monitors on both of those guys, and that Biaggi, he's like an adult playing chess. And Valentino Rossi is like a kid on a playground. And the thing about Sid is that when he was in his element diagnosing motorcycles and repairing them, he was like a kid on a playground. He didn't have that stage fright or that anxiety that somebody like me has, that I might not be able to figure this out, or I might be making a mistake. And there wasn't any pride about it. It just was.
Yep, that is absolutely the impression I get. So why don't let's talk about the meat of this story. So take me back to your father's hospital room. So he's had a significant health crisis. You have not been in much contact with him for some years prior to this. You're present with him in the hospital room, and you're concerned that that he's sort of giving up, and the life force just isn't there the way that it was. And so you turn things around with an idea for a project, and the project, of course, is to build this Vincati. And so I'm wondering what you were thinking and feeling in that moment, and particularly I'm wondering why, most of all, this particular project.
This story begins with Sid deciding we're in 2000, so we're 1 year. I always kind of fix it by 9/11. We're 1 year right before 9/11, same time of the year, and Sid has decided late in life, he's 70 years old, to leave my mother, which was a very unhappy marriage the whole way through. And I had relocated very recently. I gotten my full-time job here as a professor at the University of Louisville, and he had just decided to up and move. And we found a little apartment not far from where I was living with my first wife at the time, and he settled in. And it was a strange time, for somebody that age to just do something like that I had wished he had done sort of ever since I was old enough to, think in a kind of adult way. Mm. And here he had done it. And in hindsight, I realized he had done it because he felt, I think, that he was on the edge of having a heart attack and dying, and this was it. So then shortly after he got all relocated, I came by on a Sunday, and I found him clutching a pillow, sitting in a chair, and he was simply waiting to die. If I hadn't showed up, he would have just let himself die.
God.
And I didn't call it an ambulance. I actually put him in his car. So I'd ridden over on a bike, actually. And we drove over to the hospital and had him admitted, and he went in for a 4-way bypass. They diagnosed him as, having a heart attack, and we just went right into surgery. Mm. And when he came out, he looked at me, and the first thing that he said to me was, "Why didn't they just let me die?" And later, the doctors kind of crossed paths with me out in the hallway, and they said to me, if he doesn't find a reason to live, he's not going to live. And I left after that, and this was still a time when you got actual photographs in the mail. And in every 4 years, the Vincent Owners Club has an international rally, and the 99 rally was on the Isle of Man, and somebody sent him a whole thick packet of pictures of the races and the Vincents that were there at the Isle of Man that year. And I brought it in, just as you do, or did anyway, back in that phase of our culture. And we were looking at the motorcycles, and I knew some information about motorcycles then, but I really as I explained in the book, was running in the other direction, trying to get out of the shadow of my father. And so I saw a picture of a bike that just immediately grabbed me because I couldn't quite place it. And I said to him, "What is that?" And he said, "It's a Vincati." And it made sense to me at that moment because Sid's other great love, second love after Vincent's, were Ducatis. And I had grown up, and that's the way Sid laid things out. I mentioned his first bike was a Super Clubman Matchless, and he found one just like it and fixed it up. And that was my first road bike that I actually got my license on. And then he let me then start to ride Ducati GT, a 73, that he had bought as a rusted out, abandoned junk from, a sailor left it under a pier in Norfolk, Virginia. And he only spent, I often say $75 or did, and then he would correct me and say it was 60. I promised him the other $15 when he brought me the title, and he never did. And so I learned that was my next step up. And when I was a teenager, before I went away to college, the best memories that I have riding with my father would be I'd be riding the Ducati and he'd be riding his Vincent. And I always felt really comfortable on the Ducati because I figured if I crashed it, I was only out $60. Whereas if I crashed to Vincent, I'd never hear the end of it. And so seeing the two bikes of our youth cross like that in this Frankenstein bike way immediately made me say, well, if you get out of here, we'll build one. And I threw it down. It was almost an out-of-body experience. I'm not even sure, what possessed me to actually do that, but I did do it. And that's how the quest began.
Yeah, and quest is a great word. I'm thinking about a moment in the book which you really just toss off as a bit of explanatory background that has to do with choppers, and you draw a distinction between choppers that are righteous and choppers that aren't. And the distinction is that that when someone has cut into a frame and there's no going back, then that bike is righteous. And that word came to mind when I thought about this moment in the hospital room, because it seems to me that the offer you made your dad was also a righteous moment, that you were not giving yourself a way out. And I wonder if you were aware of that and if that was in some way deliberate.
Yeah, I guess so. I've learned in life, I'm 53 now, that I am a people pleaser. In that sense, I've inherited that disposition from my father. And so when I say something out loud and promise it to somebody else, even to a stranger, I feel more obligation to follow through on it than I do if I promise something silently to myself.
Right.
And I could have let it go, but rather amazingly, the next day I started to reach out to people, and I found somebody who was willing to sell me a Ducati chassis. He actually put me in touch with some. In fact, I'm not sure I actually even know who the owner was, but I had a go-between who handled it, who also made me promise never to reveal his name because he was a Ducati, very well-known Ducati and Guzzi Italian American builder in the Southeast. And, he just felt that the righteousness of it is in the eye of the beholder, and one man's vision of righteousness is another man's vision of rape of a good Ducati. But he sold me a rolling chassis of a 73 GT where the other owner simply wanted the engine and was going to build up a custom around the engine, and we got everything else for may have been $2,500 plus shipping. And I mean, these are all kind of figures that are hard to wrap one's mind around today, but I went ahead and pulled the trigger on it right away and walked in the next time and said, well, I bought the chassis. And at that point, Sid knew I was serious. And we started to take step after step to make it a reality.
So I was going to ask you next. I was going to say, so your dad responded to this idea pretty quickly and decisively, so it has the desired effect. It's almost, resuscitative, if you like. And I wondered if the idea of a Vincati was some kind of a white whale for him, or if maybe he just saw the chance for reconciliation in this project, with you, or if those two things were bound up in each other. But it sounds like this inspiration struck him almost the same way it struck you, that it's not something he'd wanted to do all his life, but he loved the idea.
Yeah, white whale is a good, coming back to the fact that I'm a writer, and in my wildest dreams, I would say I maybe have done something that approaches what Herman Melville did with Moby Dick, but yeah, he did not resist it, and I think he understood intuitively. We joked when Peter Egan, who's really a wonderfully warm guy, that it was engine by Shakespeare, chassis by Michelangelo.
Right.
That it is a kind of act of fusion of the imagination to see those two things superimposed over each other, and to recognize the sort of platonic rightness of what it is you want to do. And he readily agreed to it without really any sense of how we were going to do it. We just kind of fell in together into the project.
Yeah, because as I recall, at that moment, there are only 6 Vincatis in the world, and they're all in Australia. So it seemed pretty obscure.
Yes, that's right. I mean, the one that was a picture, as I detail it in the back of the book, I actually list all 7 of them, and that one was by Bruce Armfield, and really it remains an extremely rare thing to do, to the point where, arguably, to my knowledge, you could only add one Vincati to that list that I know of, besides ours, and that's really only a partial one, because it's actually one of the chassis is actually from one of the 6 that was initially built in Australia, but he removed the motor and just sold the rolling chassis. And a guy in Southern California named Mitch Talco has put a 1200cc Neil Vadine built 2 and then sold 1. And it went through hands, and it is now in the possession of Mitch Talco in Southern California, who built up a 1200 engine in it. And other than that one and the one Sid and I did, I don't know anybody else who's done it. So,
Well, and I kind of wanted to ask you about that without sidetracking this into too much of a technical discussion. This build took a long time, and I know that a lot of that can be explained by the pressures of life and by, the financial realities of taking it on. But it also sounded technically challenging somehow, more so than I would have thought. Can you talk a bit about that? Why are these so hard?
Well, I would say it's 2 things. One is obviously the acquisition of the pieces. You've got to get that chassis, and you've got to get that Vincent engine, and that is far easier said than done. In terms of the mating process, what we learned, and I reviewed this a little bit in the book, is that Colin Seely was employed by Ducati to make the chassis, the frame for the 750 when they went to their L-twin design and went from singles to twins. And he grew up in a Vincent family on the back of a Vincent, and seems to have intuitively laid out a chassis that facilitates what we're doing much more so than the Norvin, which it is an improvement on, in my opinion. And so then you've got that question, the question of what do you do to adjust Seely's frame to take a Vincent twin, keeping in mind that something we didn't review for your listeners in our early discussion of the history of the Vincent is that one of the things that they changed during the war years between the series, so-called Series A Vincents, and then the series that are the post-war, the B, C, and D series, is that they dispense with a frame and simply make the motor a stressed part of the chassis, so that you've got, in Vincent lingo, UFM, or upper frame member, that's an oil tank that then grabs the forks in the front wheel, and then you've got a swing arm that reaches back and is hooked up to the rear of the motor and is grabbing the rest of it, so that the motor itself is a stressed part of the frame. And this apparently was done at the Vincent Works simply because they did not have as much steel as they, given the wartime shortages. So they arrived upon a new engineering arrangement to account for that. But you've got a motor that's designed to be fit into an entirely different engineering arrangement than what the Seely frame envisions. And that's the challenge. The challenge is, how do you retrofit that Vincent motor to hang in the Seely frame? And that's what is the challenge.
Interesting. I didn't know that those engines were stressed members originally. That seems like such a modern concept, and I guess it speaks a bit to the ingenuity you talked about earlier.
Right. Yeah, that is one of the big, improvements. I think we can say improvements because, as you just mentioned, when you look at the history of generally of motorcycle design, this is what is adopted going forward with performance chassis. So the Vincent anticipates that, and that's part of its lightness and compactness and tremendous rigidity and its ability to stay planted at high speeds is this innovative design. But that figuring out how to combine the motor and the Ducati frame is the challenge.
Right. So I'm thinking about that challenge. I feel like I have some sense of what it takes to be a husband and to be a young father. I've got some sense of what it takes to be a teacher and to write a book. It had to have taken an incredible amount of commitment to get through this process. And I think you've probably partly explained that by saying that you like to keep your promises. But I'm still curious to know what drove you, what kept you going.
I would say that's a good question, and it's something that I think about more now that Sid is dead, and that I have continued to stay interested in Vincent's and in motorcycles. And then you and I are talking during this unusual moment in world history of the COVID-19 quarantine. And that is, that I always admired Sid's expertise at what he did. You don't meet too many people in the world where you can say this person may be the best person or one of the very best people doing that, that craft. And it was the attraction of really learning what I would call deep knowledge by apprenticing myself to Sid and accepting, which is not easy to do, accepting the power arrangement of that, particularly between a father and a son, and really getting to understand in your bones way the wisdom and the knowledge that comes with having dedicated your entire life to the practice of one craft.
Well, that's a compelling answer, and it probably could stand on its own. But when I talked about the commitment this must have taken, I'm also acknowledging that you two had a pretty fiery relationship through this, and you chafed at his what sometimes seemed like a lack of trust, and you had some knockdown, drag them out, fights, some real father and son stuff. So it wasn't only the mechanical challenge. And so when I say what kept you going, I guess I'm a little bit including that part too. I'm wondering if apprenticeship alone explains it.
Right. Yeah. When I was writing the book, I was thinking a lot about, it's a Werner Herzog movie. It's a strange movie called Fitzcarraldo. And there's a documentary on it too, where it's a story of a guy who has this dream. He's got a sugar plantation in Brazil, I think. And his dream is that he's going to have Caruso, the opera singer, sing on a paddle wheel riverboat on, I guess, the Amazon. But in order to have that happen, he has to drag the riverboat over the mountains. And of course, in order to do the movie, they had to do it as well, And the documentary is really better than the movie because you see how crazy Herzog is and how he drives everybody insane with this vision of needing to haul this boat over the mountains. But yet you're hell bent on doing it. You are going to do it, and you simply accept the collateral damage of it destroying. In some sense, I'm now divorced and remarried. It in many ways was not a good factor in the arc of the dissolution of my marriage. But yet you are caught up in it. It sucks you into it in a way that defeats rational explanation.
Yeah, that's interesting. So if this was a show about psychotherapy, I would probably at this point ask you, do you think you needed to do this work with your dad before you could be a good husband? But that's probably stepping way over some kind of line. So we'll move on. Maybe I'm just taking all this too personally.
Right. Right. Well, I'd say to answer the question, it maybe made me realize that I'd gotten into the wrong marriage to start with. And so in some sense, maybe it did help me learn how to be a better husband. I do think it helped me learn to be a better father. And that's not just in saying, well, where he zigged, I'm going to zag. But in being able to recognize what he did right and what he didn't do right, and trying, although you know that you will never do everything right, but trying in the calculus of it with your own children to do at least a slightly better job.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I thought was really beautiful about this story was how building the Vincati put you and Big Sid into contact with this network of amazing motorcycle people that he'd touched in his life or that had touched him. It seems to me a lot of Sid's past got poured into that machine. Did you experience it that way? And did he? And can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. We certainly wouldn't have been able to build it without the assistance of Con Henderson in particular and Neil Vadine, who were both in that initial circle of Vincati builders in Australia. And I really need to say that when they did it in the mid-70s, it made a whole lot more sense than when we did it, because at that point, the Ducati was brand new, and apparently a batch that came over to Australia had Duff engines in them that went south, so they had these chassis lying around. And dirt track sidecar racing is popular in Australia, and so sort of Vincent powered hack jobs, and they had some sort of beat up Vincent motors from these sidecar events lying around, and they kind of looked at it and said, hey, if we put those two together, we'll have a super bike for today, because the Vincent in the early 70s, only the Kawasaki Z1 offered more performance, and the Ducati chassis was cutting edge. It was brand new. So what they put together was really a modern super bike. When we did it, we were pursuing this strange father-son dream, 25 years later. And it was different, but they were all very extremely helpful to us. And Sid's, it is really true, as I say in the book, that there weren't many guys into Vincent's in America. And by the time we were starting it, Sid was central in that network. If you were into Vincent's and you were in North America, you knew Sid. And he was able to really lean on those friendships. And all of this pales really in comparison to what Ed Lexa did in order to make this happen. By this is a friend of Sid's who goes all the way back to the 50s as a motorcycle rider and rode all kinds of bikes. But he gave us the Rapide, from which we stole the motor to do the project. And without him doing that, we might still be looking for a Vincent twin motor today.
Right. Yeah. I guess I was caught up a little bit in the sense of the whole thing being having the feeling of a race against time somehow.
Yeah, it obviously was a race against time, and that's part of the bittersweetness of the book. I would say that I listened to your interview with my friend Melissa Holbrook Pearson, and you talked about Ted Simon, and you talked about Ted Bishop, and of course Robert Persig's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Man. There are a few, but a solid group of really good books that have been written about motorcycles these days. And if I can put my book in their company, I would say that what makes my book emotional to people who read it that I've had the chance to speak with is that sense of the autumnal, the clock is running quality of what we were doing in to eat fate and give Sid one last amazing ride before he left the world.
Yeah. It's funny how often I loved that conversation with Melissa Holbrook Pearson, and I was quite taken with her phrase "riding towards the end." It seems dark, but the whole sort of memento mori thing is such a big part of motorcycle culture that I think it's legitimate. And I certainly felt that energy in your story, even though by the end of the book, Sid is still with us. I feel like I can safely ask this because you're an English professor, but there's a lot of real life going on around you while this bike is being born, and it's hard not to see some synchronicity in that. So, your dad is dealing with his own decline. Your wife at the time is a struggling poet and seeking purpose or something. Like that. We talked just now about the race against time, and I think probably the most on the nose parallel was your daughter's imminent surgery, happening right around the moment you were about to cut into the frame of the Ducati. I wonder if you think those parallels are legitimate and deliberate. I imagine that they are, and if so, what are you telling us about those parallels?
Well, they certainly are legitimate. I would say that the one of the things that I learned in writing Big Sid's Vincati is what makes those parallels seem perhaps inventive is the failure in life as we're living it to be able to cut away all the other things that are happening so that you're not able to see these resonant symbolic connections between different parts of your life. But when you are trying to write a true story from your life, and what I tried to do that is different, I think, than some of the other motorcycle books we've been talking about, is to really give it the shape and the feel of a satisfying novel. And so what you learn is that you don't need to tell everything about what's happening, when you're doing a memoir like this. You're selecting pieces that are just exactly what the reader needs, and really in Hemingway fashion, no more than that. And when you do that, I think astutely, and if God is your co-pilot, you get these resonances that work really well because you've hacked away what you don't need.
I see that from a craft perspective, and I totally accept your answer, as supplied. But I just, as a reader, couldn't help but feel caught up in the idea that you were struggling with something that had a tremendously metaphoric quality for exactly the kind of life that was going on around you. So in other words, the weight of your daughter's imminent surgery and the weight of that no going back moment with the Ducati frame, it didn't seem forced to me at all. It felt like you were living your life through the experience of building this bike, not oblivious to it, but that this was how the story was I don't know, easiest to tell. Anyway, it felt like there was a lot to it.
Yeah, I would say that. Well, first of all, thank you for the observation. I would say that while I was engulfed in doing this project, I still really felt that whatever my ambition was to somehow write a book that would be a captivating novel or something that would, because I was an English professor, but not a book that other English professors are going to read, a book that the average person would read and enjoy. The idea that it would be about what I was doing with Sid out in the garage was something that just never crossed my mind whatsoever, as a combination between two things. One is just, as you said, I really wanted to run away from being Sid's kid. And so I didn't want to write a book about motorcycles. And at the same time, motorcycles in the cultural marketplace, we were before American Chopper, really, when all of this happened. So the idea that there's a story in the garage made about as much sense to me as the idea that if I would be out mowing my lawn, that suddenly cars would stop and people would get out, be like, hey, he's mowing his lawn. Look at those cuts. That's really nice lawn mowing. I couldn't see it until Peter Egan came and did a story on it, because he and Sid were friends from when Peter had a Vincent for a while. And he thought this was a neat story. And he came down and then I read his story. And I thought, well, I think I can do that. I think I might be able to write as good a story or better because I lived it. And so I gave it a shot. But that's the truth of how it unfolded.
Hmm. Yeah, well, and as I say, I accept that. I also, I'm one who firmly believes in the subconscious, and whatever Jung might have had to say about it. So I'm going to give you more credit than you're probably giving yourself. And I would say two things. One that no motorcycle book is about a motorcycle. So this is completely in the paradigm. And secondly, I do, and I should have said this earlier, I do think this is a canonical book. It's a pretty slim library, books that understand motorcyclists, but I totally believe this belongs in it because it does such a good job of laying bare the parallels between motorcycling and life, or the way that we work out our stuff around motorcycles, even when it's really about life, if that makes sense. So I guess that's me defending my thesis, but I accept you're saying that this just happened as it did, but I bet it was more than that.
Right. No doubt it was. I, like you, I believe strongly in the unconscious and the Freudian and Jungian traditions. And I'm happy to bring that focus on other aspects of our conversation that you would like to ask me about.
Sure. Well, I appreciate. I'll cop right up top to being a geek about this stuff, and I think it's probably difficult as a writer to kind of comment on your own work on that level. But I did have one question, and it's so supremely geeky that I may just cut it out. So if that liberates you in some way, be my guest. And the question has to do with a scene in a book, where you have just left Lex. And you and your dad are in the car, and your dad falls asleep. You're feeling the weight of that moment, and that the idea that your dad may never see Lex again. You've met Lex's son, and that makes you think about the responsibility of taking care of somebody at that stage of life, and so on. So it's a very freighted moment, and in that moment, you share with the reader that you put an album on the stereo in your car, which is Bob Dylan's "Blonde on Blonde." Now, that struck me as a detail, but I also geekily recall that Dylan once said that album was the closest I ever got to the sound I hear in my mind. And I couldn't help but wonder if there was any reason you shared that with us, or if on reflection you see the importance of that, or if I've completely made this up in a fever dream.
I think that it's a wonderful thought to introduce music into a discussion of motorcycles, because I will never be a motorcyclist who prefers to have a headset. And I've never actually ridden with a headset. And I am, as was Sid, more of a Sunday morning lone wolf rider than somebody that likes to ride in, or takes the time to ride with groups, although I like that. But I enjoy the solitude of being on a ride and often sing to myself or hear music. And Sid and I were, as travel companions, and we did a lot of traveling when he was living in Louisville. I think we carried that over to the times that we spent in the car. And Sid's taste in music was extremely eclectic, and had a lot to do with what musicians he was exposed to through his mechanics. So that, like, Sid had a love for heavy metal that I never shared ever. But
Wow.
We would, but every once in a while I would relent and let him put in Yngwie Malmsteen in particular which is this very kind of symphonically, rich heavy metal music. And he would listen to that, and we would trade off. And Dylan was always comfortable middle ground, that, he liked Dylan, I liked Dylan, and we could always play Dylan kind of in the middle of these, like, you pick a tape, I pick a tape, you pick a tape. And now that he's gone, when I look back on it, I could do a listing of a soundtrack of songs that I think about when I think about the times I spent with my dad, either riding or traveling together. And Blonde on Blonde, particularly Visions of Joanna, would be the kind of thing we'd be listening to at midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning.
Oh, wow.
So perhaps that takes a stab at answering your question.
I feel rescued. There's a photo of you riding Big Sid's Vincati on Bike Exif, and it kind of made me smile because in this picture you're wearing a mask. And it made me smile because although you're very honest about yourself in a lot of ways in this book, I never actually felt like I got to know you much as a rider. What's going on there? What are you? I think you touched on this a minute ago. What kind of rider are you?
I am a rider who grew up with my first bike being a Honda XR75 when I was 10 years old. And so I would say that I'm a natural rider I don't have a story like Melissa's, or when you give shout outs to people who are getting their first license and make that plunge. I don't have that experience. I have that experience of going out into the backyard and riding the snot out of my Honda XR75 when I'm 10 years old and feel that I'm immortal and will just rev the throttle and pop the clutch and figure out how to do a wheelie no matter how many times I flip the bike over. Just get right back up and do it again. And then probably overly reliant on those intuitive skills that you develop when you learn to ride as a kid. Even if you take years off, I think it comes back rather naturally. So that's how I got into riding. I did mention that I tend to prefer riding alone. I often have fantasized about being the kind of person. There's a guy and I may tell this story in Big Sid Vincati, or I may not, of a Vincent rider out in Southern California, and he's the kind of guy who rides all the way from LA up to Alaska, and then from Alaska all the way to mid-Ohio. And I can remember sitting around the campfire with him at mid-Ohio and asking him how long he'd been away from home. And he actually honestly thought about it and said, "I can't remember." And I asked him, "When are you going to go home?" And he said, "Without missing a beat, when I run out of money." And to be that kind of guy who's just the person kind of thing, where you're just driving across the continent. I'd love to do. I've had that dream, and maybe one day I'll be able to do it. But so far, I'm the kind of person who, if I can get away on a Saturday or a Sunday and put 100 miles on the bike, that's pretty good for me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's me too. It's funny you mentioned wondering if you need to go on a long trip. That's been a bit of a motif in these podcasts, and I get regular emails from listeners saying, "Oh, you should do it. Just do it. Just load up your bike and go." And I've questioned myself, for not having that motivation. And then I recently heard a conversation on another podcast about the Odyssey, and the person being interviewed was a scholar of Homer, and she said, what doesn't get talked about is what a hot mess Odysseus was when he got home, and I felt vindicated by that. Anyway. I thought it was interesting that Big Sid contributed his own acknowledgments at the end of your book. And that struck me as a kind of a kindness on your part. It was almost as if the bike and the book were interchangeable or ran in parallel in some way. What moved you to do that? He appeared to have been delighted at the chance. There was a lot of emotion in those acknowledgments. What prompted that?
Well, I must admit that, I enjoyed, I'm looking at them now, and I particularly enjoyed those times that I spent with Sid, where I would bring over my laptop and just type in more or less verbatim what he said. And because he was a natural storyteller. And so at that point, much to my delight and surprise, my joke about the Vincati is that the Vincati is the gift that keeps on giving. As I said, I did not believe that it would help me fulfill my dream of writing a book like this. But it did. And I think it was a way of me sharing that joy with Sid, because even though I was getting, I think, to the end of realizing that my first marriage was over, by the time we're actually in page proofs. And I mean, because that section is added at the end. But at that point, I could just come in and say, "Who do you want to thank?" And I'll just type it in, And And so he's just, when I read that, I can close my eyes and see Sid sitting in his chair saying, I want to thank all my buddies. And he was, and I think a lot of motorcyclists are this way, that your riding family becomes your real family. Mm-hmm. And those guys, largely guys, but some women too, are the people that you truly love. And it's the real affection that Sid had for his riding buddies that comes across there.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. I wonder, now I did not know until we spoke that your marriage actually ended following this experience, but nonetheless, I got the feeling that despite the fact that you and your dad both got slightly different destinies than you were hoping for in this story, it still felt like a happy ending somehow. At one point, your dad says that motorcycle was the best thing he ever did, which I couldn't help but hear both as a motorcycle guy, but also as a parent and as a son. Is it okay if I think about this as a happy ending? Was it in your mind?
Yeah. It was, again, it was true that the Vincati was a gift that kept on giving, because not only did Sid see that motorcycle come to completion, and although Sid was never able to ride it, I was able to ride it, and many other people have sampled it, which is something that Sid always believed in, was riding them and not hiding them. But we had this really remarkable run after the publication of the book that he was able to enjoy. And so that the book comes out in 2009, and Sid is able to have the fun that comes with seeing a book like this come into the world. And then we decided to do some publicity for the book, and ended up, among other things, taking the bike out to Jay Leno's garage with Sid and seeing Leno ride the Vincati. And so all of the whirlwind that came with that. And then when the paperback came out a year later, I decided that we were going to make good on the promise that we had with Lex, that if I was going to steal the motor out of the chassis of his Rapide, then I was going to buy a Vincent single motor, because the chassis is the same. So particularly cheap Brits would buy the 500cc single, drop the 500 motor out, buy up a twin motor, and they'd have a twin. So if you look, you could get an orphaned single motor, and we bought one to keep the project going. And so we finished that up in really amazing time, so that in advance of the paperback coming out, my friend Aaron Frank, who at the time was an editor at Motorcyclist, said to me, why don't I meet you at Maxton, North Carolina, and let's go get Sid his land speed record. So we took the Vincati for fun, and it turned out to be a 600cc, because with Sid, 500 is good, but 600 was obviously better. And and Aaron Frank, wrote it to a class record of 105, which is not too shabby for a 1950 vintage gas-powered over the course of about 3/4 of a mile. Mm-hmm. And so that there's pictures from that day in the paperback, which is astounding to me that, all of that happened. And then a year after that, the thing that's so fascinating about having written a memoir and a true story is that life keeps going, so that after all of that, some of my local friends here who had embraced Sid, and Sid had really become something like the motorcycle Hunter Thompson of Louisville.
Right.
Hunter Thompson's from Louisville, was into Vincent's. And here's Sid, the Vincent guru in Louisville. And they were like, let's go to Bonneville. So in 2011, we went to Bonneville with yet a third Vincent that we built in maybe 18 months, which is just, this is ridiculous. Some 80-year-old guy and his English professor, son. And we took the single and the twin out to Bonneville and completely attempted to rewrite the ending of Big Sid's Vincati in a sense, because then Sid got to go out to the Salt, and we did set a record, or there wasn't a particularly impressive record in terms of speeds for Vincent, but weirdly enough, the class was an open class, and we secured the record with a stripped repeat. That's a whole nother story, really. And Sid was able to experience all of that, and that was really fun. It was fun to see Sid get to the point where this monkey on his back that he had never gone to Bonneville and actually raced there had been crossed off the bucket list. He went, he got a record, he could talk about it. And initially, when we were out there, Sid would get out of his wheelchair for pictures if he could, because it's exhausting. It's a miracle that, honestly, that he didn't die out there. But then he would get off, so he didn't want to be seen in the wheelchair. And then when we got back, he talked on with some of his friends about motorcycles, and if it was a contentious, roosterish kind of conversation, he'd get off the phone and look at me and go, "What does he know? My wheelchair has logged more miles at Bonneville." That's perfect. My wheelchair has logged more miles at Bonneville than he'll know. And so it was like gravy. It was this unexpected, joyous conclusion. So that even when the ride came to an end and Sid did leave, I can say that we were working on a Vincent customer bike and had ice cream and watched a movie, and then the angel of death touched him, and it wasn't a pleasant week in the hospital at the end. But I would, that's pretty good in my book. If you can get in a good day's work, ice cream and a movie, right at the end, working on what you love and what people respect you for doing, you've had a pretty good life. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think you kind of read the story and feel a bit sad that he never got a chance to ride it, but the experience you've just described seems somehow almost better. At the end of the day, it would have been cool to ride the bike that he helped build, but to have all this validation and to have this kind of confirmation of legacy, all of us should be half so lucky. Did he experience that? It sounded like he did.
Yeah, he really did. You could look at the situation and say you ended up living in a ranch house, in your son's house, in a tiny little what had been a single car garage and a porch. We had converted into a little in-law suite, and then he would come out his door, and right across the little concrete patio was our cinder block 2-car garage, inside of which all of this happened. And you could say, well, that's pretty modest, for the sum total of somebody's life. But you and I know what happened inside of that garage, and it does feel like he had the opportunity to let old grievances go and to not dwell on what life didn't give to him, and instead really cherish what life did give to him.
Yep. Good innings, as they say. And the motorcycle, by the way, is gorgeous. I have to ask, what was it like to ride?
Well, I've been riding it now. I must say that although the COVID-19 experience has altered our plans for selling this house, I reached out to my friends in Anamosa, Iowa at the National Motorcycle Museum, and they graciously agreed to take it on loan along with my own Shadow and the 600cc racer, because we were planning to and hopefully sell this house and move on. So right now you can go see it at the National Motorcycle Museum in Anamosa, Iowa. But so I still own it, and up until the last few months, I regularly ride it, and I love riding the Vincati. I agree with Jay Leno, who said when I proposed that he check it out, that his initial response was, I'm something of a traditionalist. I like my Vincent engines and Vincent motorcycles, and I like my Ducatis to have Ducati engines in them. But that, hey, after having ridden it, this is really better. This is the best of both worlds. You get all of the power of the Vincent, and what is a clear step up in the chassis and the smoothness of what the GT provides. It's riding a Vincent is extremely soothing, I think most people say, because it famously, the reporters said that it fired at every other lamppost as you rode, so that it's geared very tall, and that can make for real problems in charging your system, because it doesn't really balance out until you're going like 70, 80, 90 miles an hour.
Right.
So just putting around, as a boulevard cruiser, particularly if you have a distributor, is the kind of thing that is going to end up making you walk the bike if you're running your lights and everything. But on the other hand, it's such a sedate lope of just it going bang, 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 bang. And there's something very horse-like about that kind of V-twin propulsive-ness that, as a child, I found it quite easy to fall asleep riding on the back of Sid's Shadow when we would go for rides 2 up. And given my own personal history with Vincent's, I find the ride on a Vincent to be meditational, really. So and when you replace the 50s to really 30s era suspension design of the Vincent with a 70s era Ducati, you get a much more supple ride.
Yeah, which would make it more the equal of the engine, I guess, which, starts to make sense of the hybrid. Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah, we got weights on a Vincent motor and a Ducati motor, and the Ducati motor is, if I recall correctly, 10 pounds lighter. And so they're very, very close. That's another thing about, but you have 1,000 cc's.
Right.
You don't have a 750. So, and it is really true that the midnight crew, as we call them in Big Sid Vincati, Sid's longtime machinist who did not want to be named, very modest guy, but a well-known motor engine builder, that he produced with the balance factor and with the porting of the heads. It's a very fast Vincent. It really is. Peter Egan wrote it and felt that it would easily exceed 120. And, as things flatten out once you start really getting up there, but it might be a 140 motorcycle as is without additional development. So it's stonkingly fast.
Wow. What an experience that must have been to ride. So your dad passed away in 2013, and when that happened, Jay Leno said that the motorcycle world lost an icon. And I guess there were tributes flowing in from, sort of all corners of the motorcycle media world, and you really got the sense that Big Sid was a guy who mattered. And I think that must have been comforting for you on some level, but also I can't help but remember that, this all began with the desire to try to separate yourself. And yet here is a man who clearly cast a long shadow, and his legacy seems to have been energizing for you, which is sort of the opposite of pulling away, especially as a writer. I mean, I feel like that needs to be called out. This is the thing, this was your quest and the thing that you wanted most to do. And he ended up sort of bound up in all that. And so then you have to, kind of be with all this adulation. And so I'm kind of wondering, how was that for you?
It's very much a challenge, remains a challenge to cope with, because I still harbor the desire to write a really good book of the sort that is a good novel or memoir that isn't about motorcycles. So I hope that I can do that and cross that off my own bucket list. But I guess I've gotten better at accepting the fact that I'll never whatever when the time comes to write my own history, there's no way to remove Sid from it, and I've gotten better at making my peace with that. I will say that for better and for worse, I continued to work on Vincent's after Sid died. It's difficult to do, not for the least reason being that the few others who I count as friends, but nevertheless, it's a cutthroat business, and it's easy enough to tell people that Matthew actually never really learned any of that stuff from Sid, or he's got no interest in it, and get that job for yourself, which all's fair in that sort of business. But I wanted to prove to myself that I had internalized the lessons of the master, and I have had some success on my own selling a Black Shadow at Las Vegas, which was something Sid and I thought would be fun to do for a significant sum. And last March, I won a restoration that I did, won Amelia Island Judge's Choice, which actually the judge was Paulie Jr., the American Chopper son. And so he and I had a laugh over dealing with the question that you're asking. Like, what's it like to grow up with that? That's bad. And I pursued those activities, A, because it does put bread on the table for me. It does help. And B, I think I needed to prove to myself that I could do it without Sid. But at the same time, what I've learned is that it's not the same kind of fun that it was when I was working with Sid. You know, Sid brought and really believed in a way that I don't know if you can fully understand it unless you've actually been around it, that if God gave you a day to work on Vincent's, it was a joyous day. And yeah, you would have moments where you would strip something out or, you know, nightmares would happen. But it was almost like those problems were there to remind you that, generally speaking, working on Vincent's is an incredibly joyous, life-affirming experience. And I'm much more comfortable talking to my dad as a spirit, you know, when I'm like, okay, what am I doing wrong, Dad? Like, what can I figure out, you know? And I didn't see myself as being that kind of sentimental guy. But if you're alone in your house working on something, nobody's there to smile at you when you ask for help from above. And I find that I more often than not need it, and I don't think I could do it without it. But I do find it very lonely, and I do miss him.
Yeah, no doubt. You know, it's funny. I looked at the auction listing for the Black Shadow that you built, and they presented that bike as a tribute, as something you had built as a tribute to Big Sid, which I took initially as in the way that one might build a monument. But hearing you talk, it sounds more like it was a tribute in the sense that the pupil honors the teacher, you know, by becoming a master in their own right. I realize that sounds, you know, excessively romantic, but
yeah, that's true. I will say that, and it is there's something pure in the competition among builders and mechanics that I admire and seek out as an English professor, where, you know, there's a lot of subjectivity on whether you really think Moby Dick is a good book or not. But when you have an experience like I did of taking that Black Shadow and taking it up to the North American Vincent Rally up in Shadow Lake, Canada, which is where the first international was in 1975, and going for a ride, Prince Edward Island, I believe, and it was very beautiful, and going for a ride on it and riding with one of Glenn Bewley, one of the top restorers today. And afterwards we were alone, and he said to me, you know, you really got that Shadow running well. Because I was keeping up with him, you know, and at that point the proof is in the pudding, as Sid would say.
Right.
You know, I'm keeping up with you, and we're talking, and it don't make no weird sounds, and it's not puking its guts out, and at that point you got to tip your hat, you know. So in that sense, I think it's a tribute to Sid.
yeah, and I wonder if it's some kind of closure for you too. I mean, I'm you know, much of the story has to do with your learning curve, but you know, as you say, the Black Shadow in particular is just objective proof that you can do this, and that you're you know, you're a pair of hands in your own right. I hope it felt as good as it seems like it might.
Yeah, it was satisfying, and it does provide closure to the point where one wonders what my next quest will be. Because closure cuts both ways.
Well, it's funny. I'm nearly at the end of my list of questions, and one of the remaining questions is exactly that. Do you ever think about your own legacy? When some podcaster is interviewing your kids, decades from now, what are they going to be talking about?
Right. Well, the strange second half of the Big Sid Vincati story is that after one builds a Vincati, it feels much more comfortable doing crazy things. And I ended up with my wife Gabriella, who's Slovak, and she's a Ducati rider and a passionate motorcyclist. And when the relationship started, she didn't know any English and I didn't know any Slovak, but she thought the Vincati was really beautiful and I thought she was really beautiful. And and I was willing to go to Bratislava and meet her. And now we have my son just turned 8 and his name is Vincent.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
So, yeah, it's going to be interesting to truly contemplate what is my legacy and what I will say to Vincent. But one of the things that has already happened is the first time he asked me, because he knows I build motorcycles, and I try to allow as best I can Vincent to pick up tools and beat on things and, things that Sid would never do. I mean, he just simply created this anxiety in me because his sense was anytime I got near a motorcycle and tools, only bad things could happen, which may not have been fully wrong, but, so I'd like to see Vincent, enjoying not just riding, but understanding his way around how wrenches and motorcycles work. And one day he was playing around with his Legos. He loves his Legos and he built a Lego motorcycle. And he said, "Did my grandpa build motorcycles too?" And I said, "Yeah, he did." And he said, "How come you haven't shown me any?" It hasn't dawned on him yet. You know what I mean? That the motorcycles out in the garage, I built them with your granddad, who died when Vincent was 1. So whatever that legacy is, I think Vincent's are inevitably part of it.
Right.
And despite perhaps my best intentions, the next generation of Bibermans will be grappling with the same question, asking themselves, "I'm named Vincent. What am I going to make of that?" And I wish him, with love, a long life to figure out a better answer than the one I just gave you.
You told me when we were arranging this that your book is being translated into Spanish for sale in Spain and that you had revised and expanded it. What have you added? And are we going to get to read that here?
Yeah, well, I have a copy of it here. And I got my advanced copies right before the quarantine hit and so forth. So I hope that it will be available. No doubt it will be, but I can't provide more details other than saying that it's a small motorcycle press. The first 2 books are on book number 2, and book number 1 is The Perfect Vehicle by Melissa Holbrook Pearson.
Oh, wow.
And it's La Mala Suerte Ediciones, and it's from Asturias, a little province in Spain, but a couple that are passionate motorcycle aficionados and friends of Melissa. And Melissa was the go-between here, and I'm very thankful that she thought enough of my book to insist that if she was going to take the plunge, they were going to take the plunge with me too. And what I was able to do is I was able to, there were things I'd initially put in a history of the motorcycle in between. The story of the Vincati is told in 4 sections. And going back to Blonde on Blonde, that's because I imagined it as a double LP with 4 sides. And so in between 1 and 2, 2 and 3, and 3 and 4, I initially had in Melvillian whaling style a history of the motorcycle that was essentially kind of organized around understanding the emergence of the Vincent in the first part, understanding the emergence of the Ducati in the second part, and in the third part, getting into the just sort of motorcycling up to today, or today in 2009, which I don't think has changed a whole lot, although obviously we would be talking about electric battery-powered motorcycles now, I think. So that material has been reinserted. They liked it. They understood my desire to, I guess, kind of do what Melville did, give the personal story more mythic resonance by framing it with a history of the motorcycle, and just doing where I could, cleaning it up and making it more literary, in the sense that I was having to walk a wire, having the book come out through Penguin and through a major publisher that was very suspicious of who would be reading the book. I mean, their feeling was, let's write a book that somebody in prison could read. And I've gotten letters from guys who enjoy it. I've gotten letters from people that find it important in their 12-step program, and in all kinds of other ways. It's been important to people. But the suspicion, and I'm sure Melissa could talk a lot more about it than me, that nobody who's really appreciates language and fancy words really going to have any interest in motorcycles, laid on the book. And generally, I'd like to say that I thought that I lost fewer battles than I won on that front, but that's not true. And when you're doing this kind of translation and working with a different publisher, then you're handing over a Word document that has got nothing to do with the Penguin, editorial effort. So I went back to this earlier version that was what I initially submitted to Penguin, that had the history of the motorcycle in it, and was a little bit longer and perhaps a little bit more literary as my initial text. And then I spent last summer reading it over and adjusting it where I thought it made sense. And then I gave that to the translator that this press is working with, and he would call me up and have questions like, when you say big, do you mean big like Jolly Green Giant, or do you mean big like Santa Claus? Like Jolly Green Giant, Okay, so not fat, big. And I'd be like, yeah, okay. And then, and then I'd hear from him again, and it'd be all of these things. So that is, and it's got a lot more pictures in it. It's really beautifully designed. In terms of the look and feel of the book, it feels like you need some European cigarettes and an espresso next to it in order to properly read it. And of course, as a writer, I like that. And the publisher is telling me that she is now working from the Spanish to do an Italian translation.
Oh, wow.
And my joke on the whole thing is we should then take the Italian translation and translate it back into English, and then it'll be better than I could possibly have written it. Because it'll have gone from English and Spanish into an Italian and then back into English, so it'll impress Salvador Dali or something. It'll truly be something that Jung and Freud would like in its strangeness. So that's what I did with the book, and I changed the title too, so that the title is The Legend of Big Sid and the Vincati, or in Spanish, La Leyenda de Big Sid y la Vincati. Because now that Sid is dead, and I do add an epilogue that brings that home. I felt that it really is a legend now because he's gone, and and it is what it is, and so let the mythic resonance of it, grow now that he's left us.
Yeah. Yeah. Why not? And I think that, the story deserves it. I'm really happy for you that it's got this interest in it. It's going to be somehow reborn. There's something wonderfully ironic about that. So I wish you luck with it.
Yes. Thank you very much. I appreciate those well wishes, and I do hope for a second opportunity at finding more readers. And I will say, particularly in this quarantine time, that I hear from somebody, if not every day, every other day, who's found the book, and so it has been very satisfying 10 years later to know that the book still is finding new audiences and continues to live. And I couldn't be greedy, I think, and wish for more than that. It's been a wonderful experience.
Well, obviously, I hope this story finds readers forever, but I don't think you'll ever find an audience as understanding and encouraging as your fellow motorcyclist. Just don't forget to keep us in your life.
I'll tell you one story about reading in front of motorcyclists. And I've loved reading in front of motorcyclists. And the opportunity to read in front of motorcyclists, it's brought into focus things that only motorcyclists get. And for example, I've read the bit where Sid and I are going out for riding. We're out in the sticks on old Route 17, heading down towards North Carolina along the canal. And all of a sudden he sees a car crazily parked across both lanes and manages to avoid T-boning it and running off the road, and manages to come to a complete stop without losing the bike or tossing me off the back of it. And he says to me at that moment, "You can never tell your mother." And when I would read that in a bookshop, nobody would laugh. It was just a moment of white-knuckled terror. But when I read that at Mid-Ohio, everybody cracked up and just thought, who hasn't had that moment where you're by the side of the road telling your kids, if you like riding, don't tell mom what happened today, okay? This is one that we just keep between you and me.
Yeah.
And so, I think that is one of the strange things that I hope that I hope we get better at in our culture, is recognizing that people who are into motorcycles and people that understand how to work on engines and our tradespeople and craftsmen are often intelligent readers and enjoy art and culture. And we shouldn't be telling the next generation, make up your mind. Are you an egghead or are you going to be a tradesperson? Pick. And instead go, we got to be both, because human beings, we are both.
Matthew, it has been such a pleasure to meet you. As I mentioned at the top of this interview, I love the book. I love the story. Everything you've told me here has made it all the richer, and I really appreciate you giving me the time.
Oh, well, it's been a thrill for me. We'll hopefully stay in touch.
Thanks again.
You're welcome. Bye now.
Bye. There's a famous old thought experiment in philosophy called the ship of Theseus, and it basically goes like this. A ship goes on grand adventures with all sorts of danger and drama, and then when it comes home, becomes a museum piece. Over time, the damaged and rotting planks in its hull get replaced with new ones, until, in this experiment, nothing of the original ship remains. And the philosophical question is it still the same ship? Philosophers have debated this for centuries, so there's no wrong answer. You can decide for yourself. But I come down on the yes side of the debate. To me, the ship exists for what it represents. Replacing planks is just a technicality. I think the ship of Theseus exists in the mind, and when it comes to what a motorcycle can mean to its owner, well, that's my bias. To me, Big Sid's Vincati wasn't born in the Biberman's garage. It was born in that hospital room. What got built in that garage was something much more redemptive, something that's now completely inseparable from the machine that this story is supposedly about. Motorcycle stories are, after all, almost never about motorcycles. Mine isn't. And yours might not be either. Sure, not every motorcycle has a story, but the difference between the ones that do and the ones that don't, it seems to me, has something to do with intention. When a bike's sole purpose is to be a tool for expressing your skill and experiencing the thrill of that, well, that's self-justifying. But when a bike is a vessel, a machine that came into your life to help you become something or find something, well, its nature changes. It becomes special. And technicalities just don't matter anymore. In other words, a motorcycle, kind of like life itself, is pretty much whatever you decide it's going to be. Well, thanks for listening. You'll find show notes for this episode at thismotorcyclelife.com, including an email address for Matthew Biberman, in case you'd like to buy an autographed copy of Big Sid's Vincati. That's also how you can reach me if you have questions, comments, or suggestions. thismotorcyclelife@gmail.com works too, and I would love to hear from you. You can also follow me on Instagram, where I like to post pictures of bikes I find on the street, and where you can follow many of the people I've interviewed for this podcast, including Matthew Biberman. For this episode's playlist recommendation, we go to Nashville and an up-and-coming country blues artist named Nathaniel Street West. Truthfully, I'm not sure any genre is a precise fit for Nathaniel's fresh sound, and you'll find he's got a pretty compelling story of his own to tell. But for now, let's listen to this. The track can only be Visions of Johanna. Buy it wherever you like to get your music, and in the meantime, keep staying alive out there.
Ain't it just like the night to play tricks when you're trying to be so quiet? We sit here stranded, though we all all do our best to deny it. And Louise holds her hands full of rain, tempting you to defy it. Lights flicker from the opposite loft. In this room, the heat pipes just gone. The country music station plays soft, but there's nothing, really nothing to turn on. Just Louise